Welcome everyone to this session about ramping down the CF API v2 usage, embracing improvements, and managing challenges. So almost 12 months ago, we've started to ramp down the CF API v2, and as you can see in this chart, we were able to reduce the usage of the v2 API from 60% to 5%, and vice versa, increase the usage of the v3 API to 95%. This ramp down, among other cloud controller improvements, allowed us to reduce the number of CF API VMs by more than 50%. This is the dotted line here in this chart. So with this short teaser, let's look into it. My name is Johannes Haaß. I've been working with Cloud Foundry now for more than 5 years, both as application developer and also on the platform side. With me today is Philipp Thun. He's been working with Cloud Foundry for more than 8 years. We are both developers at SAP. We are active contributors to the Cloud Controller and CAPI, and we have approver roles in the runtime interfaces and runtime deployments working groups. So what's on the agenda today? First, we'll talk about the motivation behind ramping down the v2 API. Then we'll talk about challenges which we need to consider. Followed by that is the rate limiting for the v2 API. And the exemption process, and those two topics will then show in a short demo, and then we'll close up with a summary. Okay, so what is the motivation behind ramping down the v2 API? I mean, you already saw the chart. We were able to drastically reduce the number of CF API VMs, but let's go a step back and first look at the different API versions. So the CF API v3 is available since basically February 2021. You can say it's fully available with the release of CF CLI version 8, which exclusively uses the v3 API, and this was released in summer of 2021, so almost 2 years ago. The v3 API has many improvements. So, for example, there are rolling deployments where you previously needed CF CLI plugins or you needed to do it by hand. Then there's, for example, tasks, metadata, and annotations. Overall, the API is much better structured, so you can, for example, directly access droplets and packages. And you could say that it's a much more mature API compared to v2. And also performance-wise, it's a big step. So we can see that it's in average 2 times faster. For some endpoints, it's even 5 times faster. So it is a very significant improvement over v2, and this is also thanks to the contribution we made as SAP to the v3 API. The v2 API, on the other hand, is deprecated already now for many years now already, so meaning there will be no more fixes or performance improvements, etc. You can actually see that when you go through the API docs, you will see that there's a big notice that the API is deprecated. And actually, there's already a flag to disable the v2 API called temporary enable v2, which already highlights also that v2 is deprecated and usage should switch over to v3. So when talking about the CF API, scaling is always a critical factor. As you know, the CF API, aka Cloud Controller, is written in Ruby, which is not the most efficient language. So in our foundations, we typically, we can handle about maximum 20 requests per Cloud Controller VM. That's not very much. And we try to keep it rather at 10 requests or below 10 requests per second to have some headroom and to avoid outages. Unfortunately, you now cannot just scale the number of cloud controllers indefinitely because there's a maximum number of database connections provided by us by the hyperscaler. So this is a hard limit for us, which we cannot work around. And yeah, at the bottom line, the main motivation for us is with ramping down the v2 API is that if we can reduce the number of CF API VMs, we can keep up with the growth of our foundations. Also, then if we have fewer CF API VMs, of course, we can also reduce costs or better handle AC outages. And of course, we can also focus our development effort into the v3 API. So this sounds all quite good, right? So why not just switch it off and that's it? Well, unfortunately, in reality, there are some challenges. Some challenges we need to consider. So let's first take a look at the user's perspective. So we often see that the v3 features and improvements are not known to customers. So we still see users using blue-green deployment plugins, etc. related to that, we often see the usage of outdated clients. So in our logs, we see CF CLI version 6, version 7, and only a few CF CLI version 8. So this is a big problem. And then, although we have announced the ramp down of the V2 API in July last year, so also again almost 1 year ago, still some of those release notes and notifications just don't end up with the users, and they're not aware of those changes. On the technical side of view, the CF CLI plugin interface is still based on the V2 API. You can write a plugin using V3, but it requires much more effort because the standard interfaces will always point you into using V2. Talking about other clients, there are, for example, good clients or like clients which implement V3 quite well. For example, there's a Python client which is quite good in that area, but there are also other clients like the CF Java client, which still heavily relies on the V2 API and is also not that well maintained anymore, and it's difficult to get contributions in. And lastly, at SAP, we've been running Cloud Foundry now already for a couple of years, have a lot of apps and users on it, and naturally there's a number of proprietary scripts and tools built around it, which still are built on the V2 API and which also need to be migrated. Now, with those challenges, we wanted a way to gently push users into using the V3 API, but not to overwhelm them, also to ensure that it's a smooth transitioning. So therefore, we've decided to implement a rate limiting for the V2 API. This is also based on the good experience we made on our foundations with the general rate limit and the service broker rate limit. We've contributed this in summer last year. And basically what it does, it counts every V2 request per user for a given time interval. It can be configured with a few parameters. So first of all, it can be enabled or disabled. Per default, it is switched off. Then there's a reset interval. So this is the time frame the rate limiter counts the requests for. This defaults to 60 minutes, and that's what we are also using on our foundations. And then there is a general limit. That's the request per interval for regular users. And then there's an admin limit, which is the request per interval for admin users. And this allows to differentiate, for example, between normal users and platform administrators who might require a higher rate limit. When this rate limiter is now switched on and the user calls a V2 endpoint, then the response will contain a few more header fields, three to be exact. So there's, first of all, the general rate limit. So this is, in this example, it's 1,000. So a user can make 1,000 V2 requests within 1 hour. Then there's a header telling the user the remaining requests. That's, in this example, it's 0. And then there's a timestamp, the reset header, which is a Unix timestamp, which will tell the user when the rate limit will be reset again. So in this case, as the remaining request is 0, obviously the rate limit is exceeded, and therefore the response or the request will fail with a 429 status code, and the error message is rate limit of V2 API exceeded. Okay, how did we now roll this out on our foundations? So, as I said, we've contributed in last summer and then started to roll it out in December last year. So we started to set it first to 40K for regular, and then 1 month later for regular and admin users. And this basically didn't have any impact yet on our foundations, because we typically on our foundations run a general rate limit of 40K requests per user per hour. So yeah, basically no impact there yet. In February is then where things are getting more interesting. So we've basically roughly every 2 weeks, we decreased the rate limit by half. So went from 40 to 20 to 10 and so on. And then in April, just a couple of weeks ago, we've reached the final value for now, which is 1K V2 requests per user per hour. So it's a quite steep decrease in the rate limit. Especially also the time around February was interesting, because users started to notice the rate limiting and open tickets. And with that, I would like to hand over to Philipp.
Okay, for every rule there's an exception. So in general, the dedicated V2 rate limiting and the stepwise ramp down worked well for most of the clients that we have. But of course, there are some users that require more time to migrate to V3, for example, because they depend on some third-party libraries also. And that's why we came up with an exemption mechanism, which is based on a UAA scope that we introduced. And this scope needs to be part of the UAA client called CF, which is the client that is used by the CF CLI. And yeah, there's an ops file in CF deployment that you can apply, where you get the rate limiting and also get this special UAA scope. Afterwards, when the scope is available, you can simply assign the scope to users, either with the UAAC command line tool or via the UAA REST API. At SAP, we build a business process around this. So you have to create a ticket if you want to be on this exemption list for the V2 API. And the ticket needs some reasoning. So why do you think that you need the API, and how long, and what are your concrete migration plans, and so on. And afterwards, it gets approved or rejected. If it's getting approved, then the artifact that will be used is a config file that contains mostly the user names that should be exempted, real users or technical users. And then, we have for every foundation, we have a dedicated Concourse instance running, and there's a job and a pipeline that takes this configuration and applies it to the foundation. And an important thing there is that all these exemptions have an expiration date, which is typically 6 months. And this Concourse job also ensures that after 6 months, so when the state is reached, the exemption will be removed again. And then hopefully it's not needed anymore because the users migrated their scenarios to V3. So now I will switch to the demo. What do I have to click now? Ach so. Pausieren. Ja, muss einfach raus. There we are. Okay, so this is this was live when I recorded it. So it's not a real live demo. I recorded this locally on my machine, where I run the cloud controller and UAA and some other stuff, so enough to show how this behaves. And the first thing I'm doing here is look at the cloud controller configuration, especially the V2 rate limiting. And here you can see that it's enabled, and we have a per process limit of 10. Just for demonstration purposes, it's very low, so that we reach the rate limit very fast. Now, I target my local Cloud Foundry and log in as an administrator. And the first thing I do is I call a V3 endpoint with CF curl and grep for rate limit headers. And I don't see any. First, because the normal rate limiting, the general rate limiting, doesn't apply for administrators. And the V2 rate limiting doesn't apply for V3 endpoints. So when the administrator now curls a V2 endpoint, here you can see the rate limit headers for the V2 rate limiting, which, as Johannes said, can be configured differently compared to regular users. So we log out and log in as a normal user and repeat the same things. So for the V3 endpoint, we see the headers for the default rate limiting. And for the V2 endpoint, we see both header types. So for the default rate limiting and for the V2 rate limiting. And as I said before, we configured here on this specific instance 10 requests per process. So let's repeat the same call 9 more times. So we should now have reached the rate limiting. And if I now curl the v2 endpoint again, now without grabbing for the headers, we see that we get this exception here. The rate limiting exceeded, we see 0 remaining requests, and yeah, if I would scroll up, you would see the 429 HTTP status code. So this was it with the rate limiting. Now there's one additional call to v3 endpoint, it still works. So it's only rate limiting v2 endpoints, of course. So now if I want to exempt this user, I have to target the UAA and log in there as an administrator. And then I call this UAC member add and assign this scope to the CC user. And after this was successful, I'm still logged in as the CC user. I do the curl again. To v2, what happens? Oh, I still get the rate limit. Why is this? It's because the scope is part of the token. So what do I have to do? I have to log out and I have to log in again. And when I now call the v2 endpoint, it works and I don't see any v2 rate limiting headers. So this was the short demo. Now summary and outlook. So what we showed that we were able to actually, mostly due to the rate limiting we introduced, also by trying to motivate the usage of CF CLI version 8, we were able to reduce the number of API requests based on v2 from about 60% to 5%. And this contributed a major part to the overall reduction of the API VMs we had of more than 50%. And this rate limiting and this exemption process or this exemption mechanism, both are contributed to the open source Cloud Foundry, so they can be used by anyone who's operating a Cloud Foundry foundation. And yeah, this would be one ask. So if you are a Cloud Foundry operator, you might start to think about also using this rate limiting to slightly force your users from v2 to v3. You can see there are benefits. You will, in the end, save money by having less VMs. If you are a developer who's using the API, then please use v3. It's better, it's faster. Okay, so as an outlook, currently there are no plans to completely shut down v2. There's no end of life date or so. I mean, the reasons are that, for example, like Johannes mentioned, the CLI plugin interface still relies on v2. We started some discussions, but currently it's open who's going to drive this topic. The other part is there are CF clients, like the Java client, that still need to move to v3. SAP is willing to contribute, but also depends on the community to get pull requests accepted and so on. So we plan to apply this rate limit of 1K to all our foundations. So what Johannes showed was, not the whole truth. So the 1K, unfortunately, is not applied to all foundations, but this is our midterm goal. And also to reduce the number of exemptions, so that finally we really only have about or less than 1K v2 requests per user and per hour. And so SAP would like to come to a point where shutting down v2 would be possible. I mean, you can switch it off for a foundation, but ideally in some years or many years, we as CAPI developers would even like to remove the old code from the code base. So that's it. Thank you for listening. If you want to contact us, either talk to us here at the conference or join the CAPI Slack channel or drop us an email or whatever. Questions?
Anyone with questions? Yes.
Thanks for the talk. With the limit of 1,000 requests per user per hour, I have, I don't know, when I'm using CF regular, the CF CLI, then how many requests per hour do I get when I do a CF push, CF bind service, CF restart? I guess I would not be affected by the limit of 1,000 requests. I guess you got more the CI/CD technical users, right? That's what you now limited by the limit of 1,000K.
Yeah, so for a normal user who is working in a console and manually typing in commands, it's hard to reach this limit. I mean, it's still possible because one command might issue several requests. But you are right, these are more technical users running in a CI pipeline.
Yeah, because in our team, I know at least some people still use CF CLI v6, and you would really get them to use v8 if you limit it to 10 requests per hour or something like that. Yeah. Okay, thanks. Maybe one additional question. Johannes mentioned the necessity for going from the blue-green deploy plugin, from the IBM, the old one, which is long time deprecated, to rolling update, I guess is what you say we're using now with the native CF CLI. We are also trying that, but we figured out some problems. So I don't know what the community means is a good plan for us. We actually like the ideas of the blue-green deploy where you really have a new application, because when a new application gets created, the service bindings are all newly created as well. And this is especially important for us when we use service bindings which recreate certificates, client certificates. So if you don't have client ID, client secret, you have certificates, and those expire. If you do the rolling strategy update, you do not get new service bindings. That means you manually have to recreate the service binding. You have to remove the service binding, create it again, and then, of course, restage the application. So there's potential downtime involved. Is there any recommendation from the community how to mitigate that? And that goes a bit over your talk now, but since you mentioned the rolling strategy.
So I don't have a recommendation. I know that I think it's also on the agenda of the Open Service Broker API to support updating bindings, but it's not yet available in the corresponding version in Cloud Controller. So in future, this might be possible without recreating the binding, simply updating it. At the moment, I don't have an answer.
Okay, thanks. If anybody else from the audience has a solution, please approach me later on. Thanks.
So when you are responsible of the Cloud Controller API, who is responsible for the definition of the API and the deprecation of the V2 API?
The application runtime interfaces working group, I would guess.
What do you mean, you guess?
Yeah, yeah, because this is the working group that owns the copy release. And
so they're responsible and you have to discuss that topic with them?
We already discussed it, and the current situation is that there are no plans to remove the V2 API.
If there are no plans to remove it, how can it be deprecated?
It is deprecated since, all calls or all commands have been implemented in the CF CLI, so you don't need it anymore.
Okay, but with clients like the Java CF client, I think this is used in many places for integration systems. How do you force them to update?
Yeah, we cannot force them, yeah.
Okay. So, a bad situation for you.
Yeah.
Ich habe beide APIs.